Good morning. Welcome back to another exciting adventure for the glory of God and Kings. My name is Travis Finley, and I am your host as we read the Bible for the first time again. We are in Genesis chapter 2, and we are looking at the beginning chapters of the Bible and trying to understand what they are communicating to us. And we have considered Genesis chapter 1, and my encouragement to you was to think outside of the box. That is, if you've been raised in the church for a certain amount of time, you're familiar with the interpretation of the majority of the evangelical church that looks at Genesis chapter 1 as if it is actual, literal history of 6 days that God created everything that we see. I have encouraged you to think that the text itself tells us that that's not the way it's supposed to be understood. And I've encouraged you to challenge me and ask questions or, interact with the text. But in all honesty, I think that if you are honest with yourself when you're reading the text and you've been told that this is what the text means, that if you take that understanding, this is what the text means. If you take that understanding and then you read the text itself, there are going to be dislocations in your reading. You're going to say, if this is supposed to be literal, then what does this mean? If this is supposed to be literal, then what does this mean? I have those responses when I read the scriptures in terms of Genesis 1. So I'm guessing that there are other people like me out there. And I can remember having been in college and seminary when we're talking about these things that um, to me, the mere fact that anyone questions whether or not this is a literal account shows me that there's something there that shows that it's not, because otherwise there wouldn't be any question at all, and it wouldn't be difficult to understand a straightforward reading of the text. But if you take it straightforward, there are going to be hiccups. And what ends up happening is you have to create miracle in order for the text to make sense when the text doesn't say anything about miracle. Now, I don't have any problem with miracle. Okay, I believe God can come into his creation and operate outside of the normal way of doing things. Jesus turned water into wine. Yeah, I don't have a problem with it. Jesus healed the sick. Jesus raised the dead. I don't have a problem with that. Okay? But when you have to insert it where it doesn't intimate that it's going to be there, that's a difficulty for me. I don't think that the text warrants that kind of interaction. Okay. I'm going to say that the same idea here is for Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2 is presents itself in a way that we should understand that it's not to be taken literal. The reason I say that to begin with is because Genesis chapter 2 is a depiction of what happens on day 6. And day 6 is when man is created. But if you read Genesis 2 in a literal fashion, this, then this, then this, then this, it completely distorts Genesis chapter 1. And you have to do backflips and somersaults and twists in the air to get out of. That was close. That was close. The squirrel is getting better at aiming its acorns at me. All right? So let's think about that as we're reading through Genesis chapter 2. These are the records of the heavens and the earth, or the heavens and the land, when they were created, in the day that Yahweh God. Look at that. Knock it off! I see you! The world. These are the records of the heavens and the land when they were created in the day that Yahweh God made land and heaven. Okay, now I'm going to stop right there, and I'm going to refer back to Isaiah 25 and remind you of the way the Bible speaks about the heavens and the earth. Okay? This is talking about a coming judgment, and it is talking about the earth being broken up, split through, shaken violently, reeling back and forth. So it will happen in that day of judgment that the Lord will punish the hosts of heaven and the kings of the land on the land. The Lord will punish the hosts of heaven and the kings of the land. Heaven and land. Heaven and land. It's using cosmological language here to represent people. Okay? These are the generations of the heavens and the land. Symbolic language. In the rest of Genesis, whenever you see these are the generations of, it's always talking about people. Just something to think about. Okay? Now here's where we get a dislocation. Verse 5. Now no shrub of the field was yet in the land, and no plant of the field had yet sprouted, for Yahweh God had not sent rain upon the land, and there was no man to cultivate the ground. Now if we think back to Genesis chapter 1, what day is this? This is day 3, because man doesn't exist, and there's no vegetation. There's no vegetation on the earth, on the land. That's day 3. Okay? So if there's no vegetation and no man, what happens? Then Yahweh God formed man of the dust of the ground, and spirited into his face the spirit of life, and man became a living soul, or a living being, a living nephesh. Okay? We saw that we're on day 3 because there's no vegetation. And what does God do to solve that problem? He creates man. Day 6. Day 3, no vegetation, creates man. Do you see the dislocation here? What we should have seen is that God created the vegetation and then created man, but we don't see that. Man is created, and then a garden is created with trees in it. Right there, the text is telling us this is a story intended to teach us something more than just mere history. Okay? Yahweh God planted a garden toward the east in Eden, and he placed the man there whom he had formed. Out of the ground Yahweh God caused to grow every tree that is pleasing to the sight and good for food, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Now a river flowed out of Eden to water the garden, and from there it divided and became 4 rivers. River 1 is the Pishon. River 2 is the Gihon. River 3, the Tigris. River 4, the Euphrates. Okay? Now, in the mention of these rivers, we have a time marker. Here we are in Genesis chapter 2. The time marker in history places Assyria and the Tigris and the Euphrates here, because Assyria as a nation doesn't exist when God first creates the world. So the question becomes, why are we talking about Assyria and the Tigris and the Euphrates here? My suggestion is because this is the context in which Genesis 2 is created, written. Okay? Within this cultural context, this text is placed. That's my encouragement for you to think about. Okay? Then Yahweh God took the man and put him into the Garden of Eden to serve and keep it. Yahweh God commanded the man, from any tree of the garden you may freely eat, but from the tree of the knowledge of the good and evil you shall not eat, for in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. Now, the question that people ask is, well, did Adam know what death was? You know, if he didn't know what good and evil was, did he know what death was? Did he understand what God was saying to him? Well, I didn't know what death was, so I wasn't really sure. Well, as I tell my children, if you don't understand what I'm saying to you, you need to ask me to clarify. However, I do believe that Adam understood, the man understood, what God was saying to him, because, where am I? Deuteronomy 30, not 32. I believe that the stories that we read in the Bible are contextually, historically located, okay? They happen at a point in time so that what they say is understandable to their audience. I believe the language of death here, in the day that you eat of it, you will surely die, is reminiscent of what we are told God tells the people of Israel when they are in the land, which is a depiction of the garden. Israel is a new man, symbolically, in a new garden, and God says this: "See, I have set before you today life and prosperity, death and adversity, in that I command you today to love Yahweh your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments, his statutes, his judgments, so that you may live and multiply, that Yahweh God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. But if your heart turns away and you will not obey, and are drawn away to worship other Elohim and serve them, I declare to you today that you shall surely perish. You will not prolong your days. I call heaven and earth to witness against you today that I have set before you life and death, blessing and curse. So choose life in order that you may live, you and your descendants." I want to suggest that that's the context in which to understand God's word to Adam here in Genesis chapter 2. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil is God's command. The tree of life is the positive result of obeying God's word. You have life when you obey God's word. Symbolically, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is the tree of death because it has a prohibition attached to it, so that if you partake of that out of turn, death ensues. But it's not physical death, it's social, religious, and covenantal death that we see outlined for us in Deuteronomy chapter 30. When Moses says to the people, God has set before you life and prosperity, and I have given you life and death, therefore choose life, it is in response to obeying God's commands. If you disobey God's commands, the death that is produced is covenantal death, where there is expulsion from the land. They are expelled or exiled from the land as a result of breaking the covenant with God. Okay, I want to suggest to you that picture is what we have here in Genesis chapter 2. So that the expulsion of man from the garden is a type of what we see with Israel in the land of it, with the people of Israel in the land of Israel. If that makes sense. So I'm trying to contextualize the meaning of death here. I don't believe that this is talking about physical death, because when Adam eats, he doesn't physically die. And God said that that's what would happen. What we do see happening to Adam immediately in the day that he ate of it is he was expelled. Death becomes a metaphor for exile. Death becomes a metaphor for being separated from God, who is the source of life. That makes sense. So, something for us to think about as we continue to read the Bible for the first time. My name is Travis Finley, and this is For the Glory of God and Kings. I hope to see you again sometime, and please make sure that you subscribe and make comments, ask questions, so that we can grow together as we read the Bible for the first time again.